I woke up to the stench of disinfectant and something colder than ice beneath my back. My first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. I couldn't see anything. Just darkness pressing against my eyelids, and a strange tightness across my chest. I tried to move, but everything felt numb, like my whole body had been asleep for years. Slowly, my fingers twitched. Then my hands. My legs. I forced my eyes open and saw nothing but black fabric inches from my face. That's when I realized I was zipped inside a body bag. The panic didn't hit me all at once. It came in waves, like cold water rising around my neck. I shoved at the zipper until I could breathe again. The bag peeled open with a scraping sound, and a strip of harsh white light above blinded me. I lay there, breathing hard, staring up at a flickering fluorescent bulb in the ceiling. I was on a steel table. The room around me was silent, sterile, still. There was a tag on my toe. Thomas McCain. Male. Age, S75. Time of death, S6:42 p.m. My heart thudded in my chest. Not metaphorically, I could feel it. Beating. Alive. Somehow, I wasn't dead. Not anymore. I sat up slowly, every bone aching like I'd been frozen in place. My joints popped. My skin felt like it didn't quite fit anymore. I looked around. Cold white walls. A metal cabinet. A chair with my clothes folded neatly on it. And my jacket. My old brown jacket, worn, faded, full of memories. I reached for it, pulling it close like a security blanket. Something heavy was in the inside pocket. My phone. I turned it on, expecting the battery to be dead. It wasn't. The screen lit up, and I saw 42 missed calls. All from Margaret, my wife of 51 years. Dozens of unread texts. Most were what you'd expect. Where are you? Please call me. Tommy, don't do this to me. Crying emojis. Exclamation marks. But one message sat at the top, unopened. Sent 6 hours ago. It read, he's gone. Everything is ready. Just you and me. Finally. I stared at that sentence for a long time. He's gone. Everything is ready. Just you and me. Finally. She didn't think I'd ever read it. She didn't think I could. Margaret thought I was dead. She thought it was over. She was celebrating. My hands began to shake. Not from shock. Not from the cold. From rage. Pure, steady, focused rage. I stood up. My legs were weak, but I made them move. I got dressed slowly, pulling my jeans and shirt over skin that felt unfamiliar. The wallet was still in my back pocket. My keys were still attached. I walked out of that morgue through a side exit and stepped into the night. Nobody saw me. It was cold outside. The air cut into my lungs. I climbed into my truck, which was still parked at the edge of the hospital lot, and started the engine. The sound of it rumbling to life was like a pulse restarting. I didn't drive home. Not yet. I parked 3 blocks away and walked the rest of the way. My house, our house, was dark except for the upstairs window. The bedroom. Light was on. Curtains drawn. But I saw movement. 2 shadows. She wasn't alone. I stood across the street, staring at the glowing window, my breath clouding in the cold air. For a moment, I couldn't feel anything. No heartbreak. No sorrow. Just a strange, hollow echo in my chest. 51 years. 3 kids. A mortgage. Thanksgiving dinners. Trips to the lake. My retirement. Her surgeries. Every fight. Every hug. Every night we fell asleep holding hands. Gone. Wiped out by one man. I didn't know who he was. Yet. But I would. That message told me everything I needed. This wasn't some fling. This wasn't some mistake. She was waiting for me to die. And when it happened, she moved on without even closing the blinds. I could have walked up to the front door. Kicked it in. Screamed her name. Thrown everything we built right in her face. But I didn't. Because dead men don't scream. Dead men don't knock. They watch. They wait. And they plan. I turned around and walked back to my truck. Drove 50 miles east to an old hunting cabin in Fairfield County that nobody had stepped foot in for over a decade. I opened the door with a rusty key, turned on the lights, and listened to the silence. It would be my base now. My war room. I sat down in the old leather chair by the fire and looked at the phone again. I read her message one more time. He's gone. Everything is ready. Just you and me. Finally. She thought she was free. She thought he was better. She thought I was gone. She was wrong. Tomorrow, I'll start tearing their lives apart. And I won't stop until they are both on their knees, begging the dead for mercy. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind was racing too fast, grinding through 51 years of memories like a broken film reel. Every smile, every lie, every I love you suddenly felt poisoned. I stared at the ceiling for hours, the old hunting cabin creaking with every gust of wind outside. The same place where I used to clean deer rifles and play poker with friends now became the birthplace of something else entirely. This wasn't grief anymore. This was war. When the sun finally rose, the light didn't bring peace. It only made everything clearer. My hands were steady now. No more tremors. No more confusion. Only purpose. I got dressed and drove back toward the city, but I didn't go to the house. I went to a place I hadn't visited in years, the local library. Not to read. To use their public computer. My name was still in the system. Nobody knew I was alive. I started digging. First, I traced the number from that message. Margaret's phone had saved it as Daniel W. Not much to go on. But after some quick searching, I found him. Daniel Weller. 48. Attorney. Divorced. Office on Main Street. He specialized in estate planning and elder law. The irony didn't escape me. He probably helped Margaret prepare for life after me. Helped her line up her new beginning while I was still warm. Next, I looked up our bank accounts. I'd always let Margaret handle the bills in the last few years. Said it made her feel useful. Said she liked managing things. Now I saw what that really meant. She had been slowly shifting funds. Not large amounts at once, but a steady drip of transfers into a joint account with Daniel's name on it. Started 6 months ago. Right around the time I had my first heart scare. She didn't just wait for me to die. She planned it. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling something inside me crack. Not my heart. That broke already. This was something deeper. My trust in the world. In people. In what I thought love was supposed to be. And then I remembered something else. Something that made my jaw tighten. A house. She had pushed me to sign a new will just 2 months ago. Told me it was to simplify things for the kids. I didn't think twice. I signed. I always trusted her. I downloaded everything. The transfers. The account info. Screenshots of Daniel's social media. Pictures of the two of them, smiling at a wine bar, sitting on a beach I'd never been to, holding hands like high schoolers. I printed it all out and stuffed it into a folder. Step 1 was information. Step 2 was making them bleed without lifting a hand. I drove by Daniel's office around lunchtime. Watched him from across the street as he stepped out with a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. His suit was too clean. His smile too fake. He looked like every smug parasite who'd ever thought he could take something that didn't belong to him and walk away whistling. I followed him. Not close. Just enough to learn his habits. Where he parked. Where he ate. Where he spent his time after work. That evening, I drove by my house again. Margaret's car was gone. But his was in the driveway. They weren't hiding anymore. They didn't need to. To them, I was a memory. A name on a stone. A line in a will. But not for long. I parked a few blocks away, waited until the lights upstairs dimmed, and approached the house from the side. The gate was still broken, never did get around to fixing it. I slipped through and looked up at the bedroom window. Curtains open. Just like last night. They were in bed. Together. I didn't need to see more. I pulled out my phone and took a picture. Not of them. Of the license plate on Daniel's car. Of the timestamp. Of the house. Just enough to start the next phase. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to yell or cry. I was going to dismantle everything they had. Piece by piece. And it would start with Margaret's pride, her reputation. She'd spent years volunteering at the church, pretending to be some saintly old wife with perfect morals. What would happen if certain photos of her and Daniel ended up in the inboxes of the church board? Or her garden club? Or the local newspaper that loved printing fluff about local pillars of the community? What would happen when the people who admired her saw what she really was? That was the kind of pain she would understand. And Daniel? He had more to lose. His job. His license. His clients. His spotless name. I wasn't going to punch him. I was going to make the whole town turn its back on him. Let them sweat. Let them laugh while they still could. Because tomorrow, I'd start phase 1. No mercy. No forgiveness. No second chances. Only justice. My justice. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because I didn't want to. Sleep was a luxury for people with peace in their hearts. Mine had been carved out and replaced with cold precision. I didn't feel tired. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. Every sound, every movement outside the cabin felt amplified, like the world was holding its breath for what I was about to do. I sat at the old wooden table and laid out everything I had gathered so far. Bank statements. Photos. Social media screenshots. Her message. His license plate. The beginnings of my blueprint. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted them to feel exposed. Vulnerable. Like I had felt lying on that steel table, zipped up like trash. First, I needed an alias. I couldn't operate using my real name. Dead men didn't rent storage units, make phone calls, or open email accounts. So I created a new identity, nothing fancy, just enough to exist in the system. I became Frank Doyle, a retired trucker from Indiana. I opened a free email, got a burner phone, paid cash at a gas station in the next county. Everything I needed to stay in the shadows. Then I made my first move. I scanned the photo of Daniel's car in my driveway, the timestamp clearly visible. I attached it to a message addressed to the local church board, the women's prayer circle, and a few of Margaret's closest church friends. The message was short and sharp. While Margaret McCain mourned her late husband publicly, she was entertaining another man in her marital bed, less than 24 hours after his passing. Some people pray. Others play. I didn't sign it. Didn't have to. The photo did all the talking. I hit send and leaned back in the chair, watching the fire crackle. I imagined her phone lighting up, message after message, as her little circle of followers turned into a pit of gossiping wolves. That was the warm-up. Now came Daniel. He was scheduled to appear at a local legal conference the next day, giving a talk on ethics in estate planning. Oh, the irony. I went online and created a new social media profile under a fake name. I uploaded screenshots of the bank transfers, labeled them with just enough context to suggest fraud. No accusations. Just questions. Questions that would spread like wildfire among his professional peers. Curious about these recent joint transactions. Doesn't look standard. Then I found a forum where local lawyers and firms discussed cases and reputations. I posted the screenshots anonymously and let them sit. It wouldn't take long. Whispers were sometimes louder than screams in the legal world. By the time evening rolled in, I knew the seeds were planted. Now I just had to wait for them to sprout. I drove back into town late that night, parking far from the house. I didn't go near it. I just watched from a distance. Margaret's lights were on downstairs. She was pacing, phone in hand, holding it to her ear and then pulling it away in frustration. Maybe her church friends had started asking questions. Maybe someone had forwarded the email. I hoped they had. Then Daniel's car pulled up. She opened the door before he even knocked. He looked annoyed. She looked panicked. Their voices didn't reach me, but their body language said everything. They argued. She pointed at her phone. He shook his head. Then she slammed the door behind him. Good. Cracks were forming. I went back to the cabin, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and stared out at the trees. The moon was high. Quiet. Still. But inside me, everything burned. I spent the next morning preparing the next wave. I remembered something Daniel had said years ago at a barbecue he attended with Margaret. Back then, I didn't even register him as a threat, just another smiling face with a firm handshake. He'd bragged about how careful he was with client documents. How he kept everything on a secure drive. Backups. Encryption. All that. What he didn't brag about was his laziness. I noticed he used the same email and similar passwords across platforms. I tested a few combinations on one of his lesser-used accounts. Bingo. Access. I didn't need to hack anything. Just guesswork and a little digital dust. Inside, I found emails. Lots of them. Some were innocent. Others weren't. There were pictures. Attachments. Notes to Margaret filled with phrases like "I've never felt this alive" and "he's a walking corpse anyway." That one stayed with me. He called me a corpse. I forwarded a selection of these emails to 3 legal blogs that specialized in attorney misconduct. I disguised it as a whistleblower leak. They wouldn't care about the personal drama, but a lawyer using personal relationships to access financial details? That was headline material. Then I waited. Not long. By noon, one of the blogs had published a short piece. Local attorney under scrutiny after anonymous tips surface. It didn't mention names. Yet. But it would. I closed the laptop and felt a strange calm settle over me. This was just the beginning. I hadn't even touched the core of their lives yet. But I was circling it. Tightening the grip. Tomorrow, I'd get closer. Tomorrow, I'd go back into the house. Not as a husband. Not as a ghost. but as something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose. It was strange walking up the driveway to my own house, knowing I no longer existed to the people inside it. The home I built with my hands, brick by brick, weekend by weekend, had become a stranger to me. Even the cracks in the walkway, the ones I always meant to fix but never did, now looked like they belonged to someone else. I kept my head down, hoodie pulled low, gloves on. I didn't need to break in, I still had a key. Margaret hadn't changed the locks. Maybe it hadn't occurred to her. Or maybe she didn't care. Maybe she was too wrapped up in Daniel's arms to worry about the dead. It was around 2 a.m. No lights on. No movement inside. I opened the door slowly, quietly, like a thief. The smell hit me first, new cologne, not mine. Fresh flowers. And something I couldn't quite place. Something wrong. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. No alarm. No dog. Just silence. Everything looked the same, but different. My recliner had been moved. The pictures on the wall had been rearranged. Some of mine were gone, replaced with abstract art and smiling selfies. I walked past the living room, down the hallway, into the kitchen. The sink was full of dishes. Red wine glasses. A man's jacket draped over the back of one chair. His. I opened the drawer near the fridge. Still there. My old revolver, unloaded, tucked behind the instruction manuals and junk. She must have forgotten about it. I didn't take it. Just needed to know it was still there. I walked up the stairs slowly, every step creaking like it was warning them. The bedroom door was open. Empty. Bed made. Sheets different, light gray now, instead of the blue ones she always insisted on. New life. New color. No trace of me. In the closet, my clothes were gone. I checked the bathroom. Half my old shaving kit remained under the sink. Everything else had been cleared out. Her stuff lined the counter, lotions, makeup, perfume. But a second toothbrush rested in the holder. Blue. His, probably. Still wet. It wasn't just a fling. He lived here now. Even if only part-time. I opened the medicine cabinet, more out of habit than purpose. Bottles. Prescriptions. Then I saw it, a receipt tucked between two containers. A hotel booking, printed from her email. 2 weeks ago. Her name and Daniel's. A weekend retreat. So while I lay on ice, she was off sipping cocktails under the sun. I took it. Evidence. I made my way back downstairs, moving like a ghost through a life that no longer belonged to me. On the hall table was a stack of mail. I flipped through it, bills, advertisements, a card from someone named Elise. Then a letter from the funeral home. Final arrangements. Cremation notice. My cremation. I laughed, quietly. She'd ordered my ashes, even though I was never cremated. Maybe the mix-up at the morgue saved me from becoming dust. I pocketed the notice. Before I left, I stepped into the garage. My old tool bench was still there, though messier. Someone had moved my tools. Used them. The lawnmower was gone. The fishing rods were gone. Everything that made this house mine had been either tossed or replaced. I found one of my old lockboxes hidden behind the shelves. Inside was a binder of old documents, tax records, legal papers, even the original deed to the house. I smiled. She probably didn't even remember this existed. Inside, I also found an old flip phone wrapped in rubber bands. Dead, but possibly still useful. Then I saw something that made my heart slow. A framed photo of Margaret and Daniel. On my workbench. She had put their picture where mine used to be. That was all I needed. I left the house as silently as I came, locking the door behind me, and drove back to the cabin. The road was quiet, but my thoughts screamed louder than ever. They had scrubbed me from my own life. Deleted me like I never mattered. But the thing about ghosts is, they don't stay gone forever. The next day, I put phase 2 in motion. I mailed a copy of the hotel receipt, the toothbrush, and the cremation order to Margaret's oldest daughter from her first marriage, Susan. She and Margaret had always had tension. Susan respected me. She wouldn't keep this secret. I also printed an obituary from the funeral home website, where Margaret had written a glowing tribute to me. Beloved husband, loyal partner, kind soul. It was all lies. I highlighted it, drew arrows to the receipt and the timestamp, and sent that to our neighborhood newsletter under a fake return address. People would talk. People always do. I wasn't just going to ruin them in private. I wanted the whole town to see. To feel the rot under the surface. Daniel wouldn't be able to practice law in a town where everyone whispered about how he slept with a grieving widow before the ashes were cold. And Margaret wouldn't be able to smile in church when she knew half the congregation had seen the truth behind her pearls and prayers. That evening, I sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun dip below the trees. I didn't feel better. This wasn't about feeling good. It was about making them feel something: regret, shame, fear. And I wasn't finished yet. Next, I'd break their financial foundation. I knew where she kept the passwords. And soon, so would the whole world. Margaret always kept her passwords in the same place, tucked between the pages of an old church cookbook that sat on the second shelf of the living room bookcase. She thought it was clever, hiding something private in something so ordinary. But I remembered. I remembered everything about her, even the small habits she probably forgot herself. The day after I visited the house, I returned. Midday, when I knew she'd be out. Church lunches, midweek shopping trips, appointments at the hair salon. She had a schedule as predictable as sunrise. I parked 2 streets away, hood low, sunglasses on. I waited. Watched her car pull out and disappear down the road. Then I walked up the back way, slipped through the side gate, and let myself in with the same key I'd used for 30 years. Inside, the air felt different now. Not just because he'd been there, but because I no longer belonged. But that didn't matter. I wasn't here to feel anything. I was here to dig. The book was where I remembered. I flipped to the page with the cookie recipe she never once used and found the folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. A list of accounts, usernames, and passwords written in her slanted, tidy script. Email. Bank logins. Investment accounts. Cloud storage. All of it. I took a photo with my burner phone and put the paper back exactly as I found it. Next, I went upstairs and found her laptop in the bedroom. It wasn't locked. She never believed in passwords on personal devices. It's not like I have anything to hide, she used to say. The irony made me smile. I pulled out a flash drive and copied everything. Photos. Documents. Emails. Financial records. Even a folder labeled legal, which held scanned copies of my will, Daniel's business filings, and a signed power of attorney giving her control over my estate. They'd gone further than I thought. She hadn't just moved on, she'd tried to erase me from every part of my own legacy. That was their mistake. I took the flash drive and left, locking up behind me like nothing had happened. Back at the cabin, I went through everything piece by piece. I found photos of them on vacation, beaches, vineyards, hotel rooms. Several were dated during the weeks I was in the hospital. One showed her in a swimsuit I didn't recognize, wrapped around him like a teenager. She looked younger. Lighter. Like she'd been waiting years to breathe. There were receipts, plane tickets, restaurant bills, spa visits, all paid from our joint account. My money. They used my retirement savings to fund their little fantasy. That hit harder than I expected. I'd worked 40 years on the line to build that nest egg. I skipped vacations, drove used cars, cut coupons, all so we could be comfortable in old age. And she spent it on someone else's smile. No. Not just spent it. She built a new life with it. But now I had access to every account. I didn't drain them. That would have been too obvious. Too fast. Instead, I set up small transfers, amounts that wouldn't raise red flags right away. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. Into an account I'd set up under my alias. I also changed the passwords on the primary accounts, locking her and Daniel out. Then I set the email recovery to my new address. Within 24 hours, I had total control of the money. Then I made a bigger move. I submitted an anonymous tip to the IRS, flagging recent transfers that looked suspicious. I mentioned Daniel's name, his business, and his connection to Margaret. Claimed he'd been funneling client money through personal channels. I attached a few screenshots, nothing that would get him arrested yet, but enough to start a review. Enough to scare him. The next day, I watched from a cafe across the street as Daniel stormed into his office, talking loudly on the phone. His assistant followed him in, visibly nervous. 2 hours later, he came out again, face pale, jaw tight, tie loosened. He wasn't smiling this time. He looked hunted. Good. Let him feel it. Let him wonder where it was coming from. I didn't stop there. I drafted a fake invoice from a non-existent consulting firm and sent it to Daniel's business email, referencing services rendered in January. I made the amount large enough to rattle him, small enough to seem believable. Then I sent it again from a second fake address with a legal threat attached, implying breach of contract. The trap was psychological, not legal. He'd start to question everything. His memory. His files. His judgment. Paranoia was part of the punishment. Margaret, meanwhile, tried to access the accounts the following morning. I got the alert on my burner phone. Multiple failed login attempts. Then an email from her to the bank, begging for assistance. Then another. And another. She was panicking. By that afternoon, I saw her sitting alone in the diner downtown. Same booth we used to share. Except now she looked small. Shaken. She stared at her phone, dialed, hung up. Then dialed again. I knew she was calling Daniel. I wondered if he was answering. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I had her right where I wanted her, confused, embarrassed, off balance. And I wasn't done. Because what comes after money? Trust. And love. And legacy. I'd built a life for her. Now I'd bury it. Piece by piece. A marriage isn't built on money. Not really. It's built on perception, how the world sees you, how your partner sees you, how you see yourself. Margaret had always been obsessed with appearances. The perfect wife. The caring neighbor. The gracious host who never raised her voice and always remembered birthdays. But behind every performance is a crack. And I knew exactly where hers was. Her book club. They met every Thursday evening. A group of 7 women, most of them retired teachers and socialites who gossiped more than they read. For years, Margaret had been the queen of that circle. She picked the books. Hosted the meetings. Served lemon cake and poured wine like she was running a charity gala. She craved their admiration. Needed it like oxygen. So I started with them. I printed out the emails I had found, love notes between her and Daniel, time-stamped while I was in the hospital. I added photos of their hotel receipts, screenshots of bank transfers from our joint accounts, and the obituary she wrote for me, full of sweet lies. I packaged it neatly in a brown envelope labeled "For Your Eyes Only" and mailed one to each woman in the club, using a nearby town's return address. 2 days later, I parked across the street from the church hall where they held their weekly gathering. I watched them arrive one by one, holding their little purses, dressed in their best sweaters. They smiled, waved, hugged like always. But something was different. There was tension in the way they glanced around. A few looked at their phones. One woman, Evelyn, clutched an envelope in her hand as she walked in. I didn't have to hear the words. I saw it in their faces. Margaret arrived last. She walked in smiling, holding a tray of cupcakes. She always brought something sweet. But the moment she stepped through the door, the smiles faded. Some avoided eye contact. Others whispered. Evelyn met her with a tight smile and didn't help with the tray. Margaret's head tilted in confusion. Then I saw it, her eyes scanned the room, her smile faltered. She knew. Something had changed. That night, she didn't stay long. Less than an hour later, she came back out, moving faster than usual, head low. No goodbyes. No hugs. She walked to her car and sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel like she was trying to remember how to breathe. Another crack. I wasn't finished. Daniel had a teenage son from his first marriage. Brian, 17. Lived with his mother, but saw Daniel every other weekend. I found him easily enough through social media. He posted often, photos of skate parks, music events, and the occasional selfie with his dad. Daniel played the part of the cool, involved father. But that was all it was, a part. I created a fake account under the name Jeremy, claimed to be a classmate from another school. Friendly, casual. I sent Brian a message, "Hey, man. Not sure if this is real, but saw your dad with someone who isn't your mom. Thought you should know." I attached a blurry photo of Daniel and Margaret leaving a hotel. He replied an hour later. "Who are you?" I didn't answer. The next day, Brian posted a photo of himself with a caption that read, "A loyalty is rare. Don't waste it." I knew that kind of post. I'd raised kids. That was the sound of a boy starting to question the man he looked up to. That was a seed. One I'd planted deep. By the end of the week, the pressure was building. Daniel was under review at his firm. Margaret hadn't returned to her book club. Their neighbors were talking, whispers at the grocery store, side glances at church. They were being slowly pushed out of the life they thought they had stolen. But I wasn't just tearing them down. I was preparing something bigger. Legacy. They tried to rewrite mine, to make me a footnote, a sad photo on a mantle while they laughed and spent the rest of my savings. But I had something they didn't know about. A safety deposit box in a small-town bank 30 miles away. I'd opened it years ago and never told anyone. Inside were original documents, our first house deed, old insurance policies, and most importantly, an alternate will. One I'd signed but never filed. In it, I left the house to my grandson, Michael. Not to Margaret. Michael was 28, a quiet kid, hardworking, loyal. He lived modestly and never asked for anything. I'd planned to give it to him eventually. Now, it would serve a greater purpose. I contacted a lawyer, an old friend from my military days, someone who owed me a favor and didn't ask questions. I sent him the alternate will anonymously and asked him to begin the process of challenging the filed one. It wouldn't be easy. But it would be loud. Public. Messy. Exactly what I wanted. If Margaret lost the house, she'd have nothing. And Daniel? he wouldn't stand by her once the money was gone and her name was in the papers. He was a leech. And leeches don't stay on dead skin. By the time I was done, they wouldn't just be ashamed. They'd be alone. Truly, completely, and irreversibly alone. And that would be the beginning of their end. Fear doesn't always come with screaming or blood. Sometimes it's a whisper, a small doubt, a single word that sinks under the skin and stays there. That's what I wanted now, not noise, not fire, but silence that made them turn on each other. I began with Margaret's phone. During my second visit to the house, while she was out and I was collecting passwords, I had also installed a remote access app on her laptop. It wasn't hard. Most people don't secure their devices. She hadn't changed since we were married, still trusted machines more than people. Now I could see everything. Emails. Messages. Browser history. And, most importantly, her calendar. I learned her routine better than she knew it herself. On Monday afternoons, she visited her therapist. On Wednesdays, she went to a volunteer reading group at the local library. On Friday mornings, she met Daniel for brunch at a quiet cafe 2 towns over. That was my window. I created a fake Gmail account using a random name and sent Daniel an anonymous email. Subject: you know she's lying to you, right? Body: I checked the last 6 months. Bank records. Calendar. She's not just hiding money. She's hiding more. Protect yourself. No threats. No signature. Just suggestion. Men like Daniel don't need much. He'd already lost control of the finances. His reputation was on fire. His firm had placed him under administrative review. And now, I added a crack in his foundation with Margaret. He replied within an hour. Who is this? I didn't answer. 2 days later, Margaret searched how to recover deleted messages on Google. The following night, Daniel left her house abruptly, sometime after 10 p.m. He didn't return until the next morning. I knew because I was watching from my truck, parked in the dark with the engine off. The silence between them was beginning to spread. They no longer trusted each other. I followed Daniel the next day. He drove aimlessly, made a few calls, stopped at a liquor store, then parked by the river. Sat there for almost an hour, staring out at nothing. I saw the slump in his shoulders. The kind of posture a man takes when everything he built starts to rot from the inside. He was unraveling. Good. Now it was Margaret's turn. I printed out an edited transcript of a fake chat between Daniel and a woman named Angela, just a name I pulled from a local real estate site. I crafted a conversation that sounded casual but intimate. Texts about late-night meetings, regrets, and how she doesn't suspect anything. I mailed it to Margaret. No return address. Just the printout and a note. Still think he's better than your husband? I imagined her opening it in the kitchen, alone, scanning the lines again and again, trying to spot a lie but finding none. That's the trick with doubt, you don't have to prove it. You just have to make them believe it's possible. 2 days later, Margaret deleted Daniel's contact from her favorites list. I saw it happen live. Then I watched her spend 3 hours online researching emotional infidelity and how to tell if your partner is lying. It was working. Everything I was doing was slow poison. But I still needed one final break, something that would sever them completely. And I found it by accident. Inside Margaret's old desktop folder, one I almost missed, was a letter. Unsent. Dated 2 years ago. Written to me. She had drafted it after my first heart scare. It was raw. Honest. She admitted she had fallen out of love years earlier. Said she stayed out of obligation, out of guilt, out of habit. But she was tired. Lonely. Angry. It wasn't even about Daniel. It was about me. How I'd become small, invisible, just a routine. She said I stopped listening. That I stopped being him. The man she married. Then the letter stopped. No closing. Just an unfinished thought. I printed it. And I burned the original. Then I mailed it to Daniel. With one line added at the end. I told you we could never tell him. Let him read it. Let him think it was real. Let him wonder if she used him as a rebound. If she ever really planned a future with him. Or if he was just her distraction while she waited for me to die. People like Daniel don't love. They conquer. And once they feel they've been used, they break fast and loud. That's exactly what happened. That Sunday, I watched Daniel show up to Margaret's house unannounced, red-faced, waving papers. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw everything, his hands pointing, her yelling back, both of them standing on the porch like actors in a crumbling soap opera. She tried to calm him. He shoved the paper in her hand. Then he got in his car and left. She didn't chase him. She just stood there, in her robe, holding the pages like they were burning. By midnight, he still hadn't come back. And that was the night I knew. They were broken. Not from the outside. From within. And I wasn't even close to done. Next, I'd make sure the world knew who they really were. And when the final blow came, no one would save them. Because I was no longer a husband. I was their reckoning. I didn't expect Daniel to leave immediately. Men like him don't vanish. They retreat, regroup, and wait for an angle to reclaim control. But this time, there was nothing left for him to hold on to. I had already taken the money, the comfort, the peace. All that remained was the public mask, the image of stability, charm, and respectability he wore like armor. And now I was going to shatter that too. The next step was exposure. Not whispers. Not rumors. Something undeniable. Margaret and Daniel still had mutual connections in the community. Church groups. Volunteer boards. A few retired lawyers who played golf with Daniel once a month. These were the people who kept reputations alive. And they were the same ones who could tear them down. So I made a package. Inside, I printed screenshots of Margaret and Daniel's private messages, sweet nothings, travel plans, financial details, and yes, a few more explicit ones. I added copies of the bank statements, highlighting the misuse of joint accounts. I included the funeral arrangements Margaret had filed for me while she was sleeping with Daniel. And to top it all off, I printed the edited letter that had caused their blowout argument, the one that made Daniel storm off. I labeled the envelope Confidential, a community trust review, and sent it to 3 key figures: Margaret's pastor, Daniel's former boss, and the head of the local Rotary Club. All well connected. All known for gossip dressed up as moral concern. By the end of the week, I started seeing the ripple. First, Margaret's name was removed from the upcoming church fundraiser. Quietly. Without announcement. Her photo vanished from the committee's web page. Then Daniel's firm removed his name from their website. Again, no fanfare. Just a silent erasure. They were being exiled. But I wasn't finished yet. I visited a local print shop in another county, paying cash for a stack of simple black and white flyers. At the top, a photo of Margaret and Daniel walking out of a hotel. Below it, a caption that read, "Meet Fairfield's most faithful widow, and her lawyer." At the bottom, I listed the dates from our bank account, the funeral details, and a few select quotes from their texts. I didn't need hundreds. Just enough. That night, I drove through the neighborhoods they used to walk through hand in hand. The library. The church steps. The entrance of their favorite brunch spot. One flyer on each bulletin board, tucked under windshield wipers, slid into mailboxes. I knew it would cause a stir. I wanted it to. The next morning, Margaret called her daughter. I watched the message pop up through her email. Subject, are they lying? She was frantic. Desperate. Asking Susan to come over, to help her handle this mess. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to claim innocence. She just wanted damage control. That's when I knew she was broken. Not shattered in one strike, but worn down, hollowed out, confused by the constant hits from every direction. Daniel never returned. Not to her house. Not to their cafe. He deactivated his social media. Stopped going to work. Rumor was he'd taken a leave of absence. Some whispered it was stress. Others said scandal. Nobody said his name with respect anymore. Margaret, once the queen of garden parties and prayer circles, had become a ghost. She still lived in my house. But now, the rooms were empty. The calls didn't come. The invitations stopped. And I was about to take the final piece. The house. My lawyer friend had already filed the paperwork to challenge the will, citing fraud, coercion, and mental manipulation at the time of signing. We had the original will. We had the alternate version. And now, we had a reason to bring it to court. It wouldn't be an easy win. But it would be loud. The kind of case that would be printed in the local newspaper, talked about in diners and barbershops. That's what I wanted. Margaret would have to stand in court, under oath, and explain how she planned my funeral while planning a romantic getaway. How she shifted funds into an account with a man she claimed was just a friend. How she pushed me to sign documents during my weakest days and said it was for the kids. And when the judge saw the paper trail? There would be no sympathy. Even if we didn't win the house outright, we'd stall her. Freeze her accounts. Trap her in legal hell. And all the while, I would be watching. I didn't want the house back. I wanted her to know she didn't deserve it. That everything she touched turned to dust. That everything she built on the bones of my life was cursed. Because you don't bury a man and take his crown. Not while he's still breathing. Soon, she'd be alone in every room. The silence would scream louder than the voices ever could. And when she looked in the mirror, she wouldn't see a grieving wife. She'd see what she was. A fraud. A traitor. A woman who thought she could kill a marriage and build a fairy tale on its grave. But fairy tales are for children. And this story? This one ends with truth. Cold. Sharp. And final. The courthouse smelled like old wood, dust, and the kind of quiet tension you only feel when lives are about to be unraveled. I sat in the back row, in a seat where the sunlight didn't quite reach. No one looked twice at me. No one recognized the man who had supposedly been cremated 2 months earlier. That was fine. I didn't come to be seen. I came to watch. Margaret sat near the front, alone. Her hair was done, makeup carefully applied, but it couldn't hide the cracks. Her posture was stiff, but not proud. Just rigid. Like someone trying to keep from falling apart. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear. She nodded, too fast, too nervous. She hadn't expected this challenge to go public. She hadn't expected to be questioned under oath about a dead man's money. Daniel wasn't there. Of course not. He'd vanished completely, dropped out of sight like a stain washed down the drain. The latest rumor said he was in another state, trying to start over. But in a town like ours, you don't restart. You just get remembered for the worst thing you ever did. The judge entered. Proceedings began. My lawyer, an old military friend named Barrett, stood up and presented the case. He laid it out cleanly. 2 wills. One signed in good health, years ago. The other signed while I was medicated, confused, and on the verge of death. Two versions of my intent. One made as a husband. One made under pressure. Then came the documents. Financial transfers. Emails between Margaret and Daniel. The cremation order filed before I was called. The travel bookings. The joint accounts. The dates. Everything told a story. Not with shouts, but with precision. Margaret didn't speak for the first 30 minutes. She sat silent, blinking fast, her hands locked together in her lap. But then came the questions. Direct. Cutting. When did you begin your relationship with Mr. Weller? Did your husband approve of the financial decisions made during his final weeks? Why did you schedule a weekend away while your husband was hospitalized? She tried to answer. Tried to twist things into soft shapes. Claimed Daniel had been a friend. That the trip had been planned for months as a mental health break. That the funds were for home repairs and future expenses. But the more she spoke, the less believable it sounded. The judge wasn't cruel. But he wasn't blind either. And then came the moment I waited for. Barrett handed over a document. The alternate will. The real one. The one where I left the house to my grandson, Michael. Margaret's eyes widened. She hadn't known about that. Her head turned toward the back of the room, instinctively searching. For what, I didn't know. A sign? A ghost? She didn't find it. Michael wasn't there. But the paper was. And it was enough. She tried to argue. Said she had taken care of me for decades. That I'd never mentioned such a change. That it must have been forged. But the signature was verified. The witnesses were clean. And the motive was clear. The hearing didn't end that day. It was scheduled for further review. But the damage was done. It was in the papers the next morning. Local widow faces legal challenge over husband's estate. Not slander. Just facts. But facts have sharp edges. Margaret didn't go to church that Sunday. Didn't answer her phone. Her front yard, once perfectly trimmed, began to overgrow. Her porch light stayed on in the middle of the day. Curtains drawn. Mail piling up. And I wasn't finished yet. There was one more thing I had to do. One last confrontation. Not with her. With myself. I went to the cemetery. Not to a grave. To a marker. A small plaque placed at the edge of the memorial garden. It had my name on it. A date of birth. A fake date of death. Flowers lay wilted beside it. I stood there for a long time, reading the words Margaret had written in the obituary. Loving husband. Kind soul. Gone too soon. All lies. She buried a story, not a man. She tried to rewrite my ending. But I came back to finish it myself. I walked away from the marker and drove to Michael's place. Knocked on the door. When he opened it, he stared at me like he was seeing a ghost. "Grandpa," he said, almost whispering. I nodded. He stepped back, let me in, didn't ask for an explanation. Just hugged me. Hard. Like someone grabbing onto something they'd already lost once. I told him the truth. Not all the details. Just enough. His face darkened, but he didn't interrupt. Didn't judge. Just listened. You came back, he said. I looked him in the eye. No, I said. I never left. They just tried to erase me. That night, I slept in a real bed for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow, I would return to the house one last time. And I wouldn't come quietly. because before this story ends, she'll look into my eyes and know. I was never hers to discard. I was the storm she called down without understanding what it meant. And now, it's already too late to run. The sun was just beginning to rise when I pulled into the driveway. My driveway. The cracks in the concrete were still there, weeds pushing up between them. The place looked tired now. Faded. Like it had aged 20 years since I left. Maybe it had. A house knows when it's being lived in by strangers. I sat in the truck for a long time, engine off, window cracked open. The air smelled like spring, wet soil, distant cut grass, something faintly sweet. My hands rested on the steering wheel. Steady. Calm. No more rage. Just the certainty that everything that needed to happen was about to. I got out and walked up the steps. I didn't sneak in this time. No back door. No quiet key turn. I rang the bell. Loud. Deliberate. It took her a while to answer. When the door opened, Margaret stood there in a grey sweater, hair unbrushed, eyes puffy. No makeup. No act. Just her. Bare. Small. She didn't speak. She just stared. Mouth slightly open. As if her brain couldn't process what her eyes were telling her. I stepped forward. Good morning, Margaret. Her hand went to her chest. Not dramatically. Instinctively. Like she expected her heart to stop again. You, she whispered. Alive, I said. Yes. Still, she said nothing. I stepped past her into the house. She didn't stop me. Inside, it smelled like dust and cheap candles. The furniture was rearranged. My photos were gone. But the bones of the place were the same. I stood in the center of the living room and turned to face her. You had the whole town fooled. But not me. Not anymore. Tears welled in her eyes. Real or not, I didn't care. I thought you died? I interrupted. You thought I died. And before my body was even cold, you were climbing into bed with a man half your age, draining the accounts, changing the locks, planning your new life. It wasn't like that, she said weakly. No? I said. Because from where I was standing, it looked exactly like that. She sat down slowly on the arm of the couch, her hands shaking. I didn't know what to do, she said. I was alone. You were gone. You were free, I corrected. That's what you felt. Freedom. And you couldn't wait to spend it. She looked up at me. You don't know what it was like being with you at the end. You were cold. Distant. You stopped seeing me. I was dying, I said. She flinched at the word. I walked into the kitchen. The same table. Same chairs. I ran my hand across the surface, remembering all the mornings I sat there drinking black coffee while she made toast. The laughter. The silence. The life. All of that, I said, gesturing around, meant something. Or at least I thought it did. But now. You turned it into ash. I didn't mean to hurt you. I turned back to her, leveled my eyes with hers. You didn't think I'd know. That's the truth. You thought you'd won. That you'd gotten away with it. Silence stretched between us. Then she stood. What are you going to do? Kill me? I almost laughed. The idea that she thought this was about revenge in the simplest sense. About violence. No, Margaret, I said. I'm not here to kill you. I walked over to the desk and pulled out a manila envelope I'd brought with me. I'm here to give you this. I handed it to her. She opened it slowly. Inside were documents. Bank statements. Emails. Photos. Legal papers. The entire paper trail of everything she and Daniel had done since the day I died. She looked through it, page by page, her hands trembling. "What is this?" "It's the truth," I said. "Every lie. Every betrayal. Every dollar you stole. Every promise you made to him. It's all there. And copies have been sent to every legal, financial, and religious institution you ever cared about. The only reason you're not in court yet is because I wanted to be the one to hand you the last nail." Her lips quivered. Her eyes glistened. "You can't?" "I already did." I turned toward the door, pausing just before stepping out. "One more thing." She looked up. "Daniel never loved you. He told people you were a placeholder. Said you were desperate. Said you were easy. And now he's gone. Just like your money. Just like your reputation." Tears fell freely now. Her body sagged. I opened the door, felt the morning air on my face. "You took 51 years and traded them for 2 months of attention," I said. "Now you have the rest of your life to sit in this house and remember the man you threw away." I walked out without another word. Outside, the world was bright. The sun was up. Cars moved down the street like nothing had happened. But something had. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't go to Michael's either. I just drove. Windows down. Music low. Breathing like a man who had come up from underwater. I had no plan for what came next. But for the first time in a long, long time, I felt alive.